early on into the season, and we've already talked a lot about the 2025 NHL Draft. But there's one thing that I'm starting to wonder about this class. Is this a weak draft year? You wouldn't really think it because of the top end players that are simply brilliant, like James Hagens, Porter Martone, and a lot more. But to me, there's one thing that I'm starting to notice about this class that has me a little bit worried. So make sure you watch till the end as we go through this draft class, go deep into it, and dissect the strengths and the weaknesses and what could happen next. And of course, make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content, and especially draft content just like this leading up to the draft next year. But let's talk about this draft class, because this is a theme that I'm starting to see a lot out there, and a running kind of stigma around this class that it is a pretty weak year. But that's not because of the top end, because I think honestly the top 3 or 4 prospects are a pretty great group. You got James Hagens, who to me is still the first overall pick. There has been some debate between him and specifically Porter Martone, but in Hagens' case, he's still my number 1 by a clear margin, just doing so many good things already in the NCAA with BC. In 8 games, 1 goal, 10 assists for 11 points. For an 18-year-old, especially at his size, it's already pretty impressive. But aside of that, of course, you got Porter Martone, who is the best winger in this class by a pretty clear margin. The power forward of the future, somebody that reminds me so much of Corey Perry with the way he plays, with just the intensity he brings. You can see the production this year. It's silly. In 16 games, 16 goals, 16 assists for 32 points. At this stage, even though it is still early, the fact that he's still rocking a 2-point per game clip is just unbelievable. And then you go into Michael Misa, who's even more impressive, because in his case, he has a better point per game at 39 points in 19 games, 23 goals with Saginaw. He also hasn't even turned 18 yet, turning 18 all the way in February, and also considering Misa's a centerman, that could also play into, I think, a lot of teams' rankings. And then you have somebody that's also creeping his way into a lot of top 4s in Matthew Schaefer, who I think is starting to run away with the best defenseman of the class title. He's somebody that was diagnosed with mono early in the season, but of course, as a late birth date, as a September birth date, he's somebody that had a lot of room to grow, but you wouldn't really notice that he had this sickness, that he was dealing with it, because his start to the season has been unbelievable. In 9 games of Erie, he has 4 goals, 7 assists, 11 points, has already had some brilliant moments for them, and to me is really no question now the best D-man. I think if you put this top 4 and you compare it to a year like 2023, I honestly think I would prefer the top 4 in this class, in players like Hagens and Martone and Misa, and just how dynamic these guys can be. Honestly, I think there is the competition there, and honestly the argument that 2025 has the edge. But you end up stacking up this top 4 against what 2023 had to offer, and my rankings looked quite a bit different from what the top 4 actually was. But of course, we end up seeing Macklin Celebrini go first overall, then Lev Shinov, then Beckett Seneca, and Caden Lindstrom. And I like all 4 of those players, especially of course in Celebrini's case and Lindstrom's case. But a player like Demidov going outside the top 4 weakens that top 4 a little bit for me. But the fact you have players like Hagens and Martone and Misa and Schaefer, and the way they're playing this year, how dynamic they've been, you could give an argument, and I think a pretty great one, that 2025's top end is better than 2024's. But even though I would give the edge to 2025 in that department, there is one thing that's starting to worry me about this class. Even though this top 4 and the top end of this draft class is absolutely brilliant, outside of it is where I think my concerns start to come. Because I think in 2023, it was a much different case where it was pretty even. And I think there was not a huge difference between most of the players at the top end. And once you start to get into past the top 15 range, there was still some great players available that had good individual traits. And you could see a great NHL player coming out of them. In 2024's case, though, I think this is a lot different. You look at the 2023 draft, and I honestly think it was a pretty balanced draft class. I think you had the clear number 1 in Celebrini, and to me, the clear number 2 in Ivan Demidov. But after that, I think it was pretty balanced between number 3 and like number 15. There were so many different guys that went higher or lower than I was wanting them, but I could see why. They had clear NHL traits. A great example of that is a Carter Yakimchuk, who I had a lot lower than the Senators ended up taking him, but I could see why they would take a player like that, considering the confidence and the offensive skill set he had. It wasn't, I don't think any pick inside that range was going to be absolutely horrible and the worst decision of all time. And I think for 2024's case, that balance was a pretty clear strength. I mean, the fact that you had players like Zane Perret going 9th overall, Z Buum going 12th, Sam Dickinson in number 11, and then even outside of that, players like Konsta Helenius and Michael Branzik-Newgard, and even outside the top 15, players like Cole Eisman and Michael Hage. There was clear talent there all throughout the first. You compare that to one of the more recent rankings we've seen for the 2025 NHL draft with the elite prospects ranking, and there are some things I disagree with. I mean, a player like Roger McQueen at number 2 over a Misa and a Martone, I just think is unreal. I like the potential of McQueen, but let's of course say that in this type of ranking that it was Hagens, Misa, Martone, and Schaefer inside that top 4. You have a lot of players, I think, outside of that range who are solid and bring decent potentials, but I think there is a pretty clear drop off after that top 4. I mean, Roger McQueen is somebody that you could have number 5, you could have outside of that top 4, even inside it, but I think there's a pretty clear difference in the player now in a player like McQueen versus a player now in a player like Misa. I think there's a clear difference in their impact this year. We can debate the potentials, but as of right now, there's a clear difference. But that's the thing to me, is that outside of the top performers this year, I think we've seen a lot of these prospects struggle and not really have as good of seasons as we were maybe expecting. I mean, a player that I've watched every single game of, Logan Hensler, is just in a weird spot with Wisconsin, has had some injuries and just isn't really feeling himself as much as he maybe should have been at this stage of his career. But you've got players also outside of it like Malcolm Spence who are good, but I don't think are going to be great NHLers. And players like Ivan Ryabkin and Anton Frindell, who have dealt with just weird situations. In Ryabkin's case, he's somebody that was all over the place this year in the MHL, potentially going to the USHL, is going to have a weird draft year no matter what. Anton Frindell had a rough injury to start out and is really slow getting back into the swing of things at Sweden, and he's somebody that was looked at as a top 3, top 4 guy coming into the year. Every other year or so, you have somebody that is in that top 5 coming into the season that ends up dropping quite a bit, but it feels like this year we have more of those guys than usual. I mean, Ryabkin and Frindell, they were number 2, number 3 for me coming into the season, and now I don't even know if I would have either of them inside my top 10. And that just means that anybody that is performing or exceeding expectations is going to get a lot more of attention from me. Victor Eklund is one that I've absolutely loved, and his performance in the Allsvenskan this year has been unbelievable. Almost a point per game, 8 goals, 14 points in 16 games, which for any 18-year-old is extremely impressive. You got a player like Lyndon Lakovic as well, who's been playing very well in the WHL this season, 26 points, 10 goals in 21 games. But Lakovic is kind of the great example, I think, of this draft class, where he's somebody that might not have even been in my top 20 a year ago, but is somebody that maybe could inch inside the top 10 with just the tools there and the potential. But he's another guy that I think isn't even that great right now, but you're betting on potential in the future. But that's just kind of the feeling I get with this draft class. It's just very unpolished, very unrefined, and for a lot of the guys here, it's just kind of been disappointing season after disappointing season, which again makes the difference between them and the top end that much more clear to me. This, more than maybe any other season recently, is a clear tank season. The difference between a 2nd, 3rd, 4th overall pick and even like 7th overall to me is absolutely undeniable. It is a game of inches, obviously, especially in the standings, but I cannot emphasize enough the difference in prospect that you would be getting. It's not uncommon for there to be draft classes that are pretty top end heavy. I remember 2020 was also a similar situation. Looking back on it, not quite as much, but I remember that being a very top end draft, especially in the top 10. This year, though, I think it's just a different story because it's not a top 10 that's strong and the rest is a little bit of a question mark. It's really just the top 4, and outside of that, there's so many question marks, so many concerns that I have over a lot of different prospects. I could see a lot of these guys obviously becoming NHLers, and they likely will, but a lot of these guys bring major concerns to the game for me, and besides that top 4, I think nothing is locked in. Which leads me on to Tankathon, because if there is this clear, straight up top 4 that is definitively better than the rest, then it really makes the lottery that much more impactful. I mean, you got teams that are kind of in weird stages that really could use a great player like a Misa, like a Martone, like a Hagens, like a team like the Philadelphia Flyers that right now are in 8th place. Even a team like Chicago, if they were to finish 6th last in the NHL this year, and that was going to be their position in the draft lottery and in the draft itself, to me, that would be a major loss for Chicago going forward. I think they could really use that extra piece that could really propel them in a major way. But if they're outside that top 4, that top 5, I think that could have ramifications down the line. You'd still be getting a good player, and I think a player like Roger McQueen, for example, would be something that Chicago would love to have. But at the same time, I think there's a clear difference in potential, in play, and impact. And I think for some of these rebuilding teams that maybe are overperforming, that could have an impact for them later on. But going back to the elite prospects ranking, I think if you're a team that just misses the playoffs or maybe loses in the first round, I don't think it's that big of a deal. Obviously, not winning the Stanley Cup would be a big deal to some teams, but in terms of the prospect quality, I don't think you'd be missing too much on going from 10th to 16th overall, for example. I mean, you look at a player like Brandon Coots, who's 10th on Elite Prospects board. I like him, but is he just going to be this great 10th overall pick? I don't know if that's the exact type of spot I'd have him at, compared to positions like Anton Frindell and Logan Hensler and Ratty Murka and Blake Fiddler, for example, who are in that 14 to 16 range for Elite Prospects. Obviously, that might not turn out to be the draft order by the end, but I think it just goes to show there's still quality there. They're at really that entire top 20. I don't think there's really much of a difference between, honestly, even number like 6 and 7 and 20th overall. And that's not necessarily a problem for me, because I absolutely love drafts like these that are all over the place, that are extremely even, and that's just so much more fun to talk about because there's so much closer between these prospects. But I think it will be an interesting factor for teams, especially trading wise, on draft day, because I think that really changes how these teams talk about these prospects and potentially make trades in the future. But I think if this does continue, obviously it is early, we're still in the middle of November, obviously, but if this trajectory does continue, I think it could lead a lot of teams potentially in that 7 to 8 range to potentially drop down in the draft. But I think also a big factor for a lot of teams is that the fact that this isn't really the best defensive crop either in the world, especially compared to last season, where you had a plethora of honestly elite defensemen in the class. 2024, we were absolutely handed so many great defensemen. This year, it's not quite the same way. To me, still the top two is Schaefer and Hensler, but outside of that, there's a bunch of guys that have potential that could be in that range, but you wouldn't really bet on being top ND. I mean, a player like Jackson Smith is a lot of fun, but has his problems. Ratty Murka is kind of on the opposite side of things. And you just go down the list, and there's good defensemen, but it's definitely not compared to 2024 at that same level. The one thing, though, that I will say that 2025 could have over 2024, besides the top 4 players, is actually the goaltending. And there's a couple of guys that you could consider as first-round quality prospects for this draft, which, of course, is an improvement over what we saw last year, where it was always kind of second-round plus and always debating where those goalies would go after the first round. Compared to this draft, you could see a couple of them inside the first, and of course the main one is Joshua Ravensbergen, who at 6'5", 192 pounds, brings excellent size and hasn't even turned 18 yet. And considering how solid he's done in the WHL, I think that'll be a big factor for these teams going forward. He's somebody that I could also see being in the mix potentially for the World Juniors already, which would be a ton of fun. You also got Jack Ivankovich, who I don't think is going to be on that same stature, mostly just because of his height at 5'11", 179 pounds. I'm personally not somebody to disregard a goalie because of size. I mean, Dustin Wolf was one of my favorite goalies back in that 2019 NHL draft, and it was the same similar situation to him. But you could see what Ivankovich has been able to do also, a 904 save percentage in 11 OHL games, which doesn't look extremely impressive on its own, but you got to consider that CHL goalies usually aren't at that top end level, and honestly, anything above a 900 save percentage is pretty good. Ravensbergen, though, considering the pedigree and the size especially, is the most likely guy to go in the first round. I don't see Ivankovich being on that same level unless some team really adores him for some reason, but Ravensbergen really is the prize of this draft class, and we didn't really have a top-end goaltender last year. This year, though, it seems to be a little bit different. And hey, no matter my concerns on this draft class and the weak depth that we might see, in Ravensbergen's case, the fact that we could have a first-round goaltender is always nice to see. Now, looking at all the draft classes of this decade, in the 2020s, of course, with 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, when we take all these draft classes into account and how the 2025 draft, to me, is looking, I would say it's a lot more on the 2021 draft type of end. Now, this draft class was a lot more defenseman heavy, so it's not an exact comparison, but I think in terms of actual impact at the end of the day, I think 2021 is the closest. Though I think the problems for both draft classes, 2021 and this year, are different, whereas this draft class has great top-end talent but a lack of depth. Well, I think the 2021 draft was really balanced but didn't really have that top-end talent. If we're just taking years into account, and I think the impact these classes will have at the NHL level, I think it's a lot more towards 2021. I do think it'll be a little bit better than 2021, hopefully, but I wouldn't get your hopes up too much that we're going to see another 2023 type of impact, for example. That draft is looking unbelievable right now. That's not the type of draft that this is looking like. In fact, I think you could make the case that 2023 is just 2025, but beefed up a little bit more. You still have the same type of impact at the top end, though, of course, you had a generational player in Connor Bedard, so it was a little bit of a difference there. But you had the defenseman outside the top 4. That could have been solid, but will probably end up around that range. But I think 2023, in terms of the defensemen, in terms of the positions, is probably the closest. But I think in 2023's case, I mean, the depth was just unbelievable. I don't think you're going to get a player like Ryan Leonard at 8th overall, or a Daniel Boot at 12, or a Zach Benson at 13, or an Axel Sandin-Puig at 17. I don't think there's that type of players, but hopefully the depth will be a little bit more impressive than what we've seen so far, because I think that is really going to make or break this draft class in the end. But I just want to make a quick video on some of my thoughts around this draft class so far, and I hope that these end up changing. It is still early on in the season, so hopefully for some of these prospects it may end up being rust. I mean, a player like Anton Frindell is just getting back into the swing of things, so hopefully we see this draft class take shape by the end of the season. But that's at least what I'm thinking so far in November. Let me know down below what you guys think about my thoughts. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Where do you see the 2025 draft among all the recent drafts that we've seen? And of course, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and share a video with all the hockey fans you guys know online. And of course, click on this card for all my hockey prospect talk in one playlist right there for you to binge. And I will see you guys in the next one. Have a great hockey day, and goodbye.